Republican officials are starting to get worried that Donald Trump's insistence that the elections were fraudulent, that they were rigged, is going to blow up in their face. In fact, over the weekend, their fears were starting to get realized when Republican voters point blank asked Ronna McDaniel Romney during a stop in Georgia, why should we vote if the system is rigged against us? In fact, here's some of that. Take a look.
Machines are switching the votes, and we go there in crazy numbers, and they should have won, but then there's still.
Yeah, we have to. We didn't see that in the audit, so we've got to just that evidence I haven't seen. So we'll wait and see on that.
How are we going to do money and work when it's already decided?
It's not decided. This is the key.
No.
It's not decided. First of all, David Perdue still has 100,000 vote lead over John Ossoff right now with the certification. So if you lose your faith and you don't vote and people walk away, that will decide it.
The desperation right there. So look, how do you know? Well, I mean, I guess you don't, Republican voters, so I guess just don't turn out the vote. I mean, it's rigged anyway, right? No. Seriously, though. The system does work. That's not to say that there hasn't been issues with voting in the past, or still won't be issues going forward, of course. Yeah. I mean, look, primary elections are a good example, right? So now, primary elections, we had some issues, right? Now, that's different than the general election process, because primary elections are mostly hosted by, or I should say 100% hosted by and controlled by the parties themselves, RNC versus the DNC, with their different rules. Now, the reason I bring that up is because you can actually put your thumb on the scale in those cases. Now, that doesn't mean voter fraud. It doesn't mean stealing votes. Doesn't mean switching votes. Doesn't mean changing votes or anything like that. But really, it comes down to being able to influence voters in certain ways, to vote for certain ways, despite them maybe favoring other policy outcomes that the candidate that you're ultimately going to put up as the representative of your party has. And so, but that's, again, entirely different than the general election process. You also have in primaries locking third parties out. And then, of course, there's voter suppression involved in both the general election and the primary election. That said, right, in the general, enough voters getting involved, and in the primaries as well, make the likelihood of these things actually swinging an election incredibly small. But none of this has to do with voter fraud. So understand, like, I'm speaking, I'm talking about nuance here, because it turns out nuance kind of important. That said, there's nothing to back up Donald Trump's claims of widespread voter fraud. And that has been proven, or I should say, Donald Trump hasn't been able to prove his case in court numerous times. Over 30 court cases, all either dismissed or they just basically said, we're going to withdraw our case because we don't have evidence. And so that said, errors do happen in every election. They happened in 2016. Nobody said anything about that. Human error, lost votes, tabulation errors, machines going down, that kind of stuff. Even sometimes improper vote counts. That has happened before as well. So, but none of that proves to have been malicious or fraudulent in court. And so, again, when it comes to voter fraud, it is very, very, very rare. But here's the problem for Republicans. Because Republican politicians know that their ideas are unpopular, and they know that demographically they're rapidly declining and are approaching basically being a permanent minority if they stick to their appeals to white supremacy and they don't want more people voting. So what they do, instead of actually branching out their party and saying, and I remember back in 2012, they did like a post-election, I forget the word, but they looked at it and they said, boy, we really need to reach out to Latinos. We need to reach out to these other groups because our primarily white working class base, in the Midwest and in the Rust Belt, they're declining, not doing well. So maybe we should start to reach out to Latinos. We should reach out to black people, black voters, and try to get them on our side. Did they do that? No, absolutely not. That said, this time, Donald Trump did get more Latino voters than he did last time, and more black voters. So, again, not very many, but Democrats, pay attention. You might want to start shoring up your own freaking base. That said, Republicans really are focused on voter suppression. They want to make voting harder, okay? And part of that involves spreading falsehoods about voter fraud. So now they do that in order to push things like voter ID, things that traditionally have made it harder for black people to be able to vote. And so we also have stripping Title V from the Supreme Court with the Supreme Court from the Voting Rights Act, which of course would allow states to be able to, who have traditionally had voter suppression, to be able to bring it back with a vengeance, and they have. And as a result, yes, Republicans have won a few elections. 2016 is a great example of that. But in order to do that suppression, they have planted into the mind of every Republican voter that if they lose an election, that every election that they lose is now somehow rigged. And so that is, again, this is something that's been building out throughout the years, throughout the decades, and it's been reinforced by right-wing media. Voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. It's getting massive. It's getting to be a real problem. And now it's blowing up in their face. It doesn't take long for people to drop the, well, it's rigged if they lose part and just assume that most elections are rigged, especially after a loss. And we've arrived here at that very moment. And so this puts, of course, Ronna McDaniel Romney in a very hard position, very difficult position. Not that I'm like bemoaning that or anything, no, if anything, I'm like, ha ha. Oh, look, it's the consequences of your own actions. Funny. But no, the reason that I say that it puts them in a hard position is because I know that they know that their entire voter fraud shtick is bullshit. And that's why she has to say, well, we're going after the voter fraud, but still please vote. Please vote for us. Still please turn out. Because if they don't turn out, their voter suppression methods, the entire reason that they push this voter fraud narrative falls apart. Because you still actually, it doesn't matter how much you suppress their voters, you still have to turn out theirs. Or I'm sorry, you still have to turn out yours. And so, again, they got to keep saying, we're going to go after voting fraud, because if they don't, they expose themselves also for being liars. And that's what they are. But over here, and this is where it becomes difficult, you've got Donald Trump that's out there saying, no, everything's rigged. He's having a post-election meltdown. He's, just going off the deep end, talking about how everything is fraudulent and how he won by great big numbers, to tremendous numbers, if it weren't for that damn fraud. And now, like, the Republican voters are massively confused. And some are even turning against the party itself. For example, you've got a Republican donor, a major Republican donor, that is now disillusioned. This is Fred Eshelman, and he has sued True the Vote. Now, True the Vote promised to investigate, litigate, and expose illegal balloting and fraud in the 2020 general election. Well, so what happened? Well, they didn't find any. There's no evidence. Now, Eshelman claimed that after giving the money, he had regularly and repeatedly asked for updates on how this is going. Did you find the fraud yet? Do you have any leads? What's going on? I'm supporting you, but give me an update. Give me something to show that I just didn't waste all that money. In response, he received, quote, vague responses, platitudes, and empty promises. What, was he talking to, like, the Democratic Party? Because that's generally only what you get from them. That said, True the Vote, the only reason they could give those vague, empty promises and platitudes is because that's all they have. They don't have any evidence. Eshelman donated over $2.5 million to this effort. First, $2 million in one installment, and then after the group's president asked for more money. Hey, yeah, we need more money to complete our mission, of exposing this massive voter fraud. Just chip in more. He gives an additional $500,000. And then, of course, when nothing happened, Eshelman asked for his money back. And he said that it became obvious that the group would not be able to execute their plan. Eshelman said in the complaint that True the Vote offered him, and this is funny, this is how you definitely 100%, 150% know that they're full of shit. They offered him $1 million if he wouldn't sue. Now, here's what True the Vote did. They filed 4 lawsuits in the weeks after the election in Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Nothing happened there. They dropped the suits because they had no evidence. And it's because the entire thing was a scam. I seriously wonder how much money they may have put in their pockets. I haven't seen their expense reports. I have no idea. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's some skimming going off the top, because this entire thing, again, there's no evidence of voter fraud. There's a voter fraud commission during the Trump administration that found absolutely no voter fraud. And so we've traditionally known from numerous studies that there's just not voter fraud in any statistically significant amount. It's like what, 0.0000006% to around 0.0000025%. That's a lot of zeros. And so it's statistically insignificant, it's incredibly small. Out of hundreds of millions of votes cast, you had a handful of cases that successfully went to court. And and of that, even fewer convictions of in-person voter fraud. It just doesn't happen. And mail fraud is about the same. Is it slightly more susceptible to fraud? Yes, it is. But you're talking like 0.1% more. And so, again, not statistically significant. And states like Oregon have been voting by mail for decades, safely and securely. And so it's just not a thing. They don't have any money. Or I'm sorry, they don't have any evidence. And yet, the money kept pouring in to these groups, and they kept taking it. And it feels like it was just one of those money-making schemes gone out of control. And so here's the thing, though. I don't feel bad for the donors. No, to be honest, it's pretty sweet karma watching them, lose their money, and then also watching these organizations get sued over blatant bullshit lies. So I feel like this is a party, the Republican Party, is finally receiving some sort of karmic backlash for peddling their nonsense bullshit. Because now, well, they've bought into their own supply. They're high off their own supply, bought into their own bullshit. And now, the fate of the Senate hangs in the balance. I'm so here for it. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and share with your friends. You can subscribe and help out the channel by becoming a patron. It's patreon.com/Jeff Waldorf. Or you can become a channel member as well by hitting the join button below.